All right. Keep an eye on that, okay? The recording. Make sure I'm always I'm recording. I try to pause whenever Yeah, because I try to pause in the dead zones or whatever, but just make sure the thing is going because I don't want. So, hello.
Hello.
Welcome back. So, last week Monday, we were working on texturing and procedural textures, right? We basically were looking at the different types, the 2D materials, the 2D materials, the 2D textures, the 2D textures, and the 3D textures, all right? One of the things we haven't talked about yet is under the 2D textures, the file texture. The file texture is actually the ability to map an image to our model. And so today I want to talk a little bit about file mapping, and I also want to talk about UV maps and what's actually happening on the surface. Can you shut that door back there, Nathaniel? Sorry. I'm sorry. I want to, before I do all that, I want to take attendance. So today I want you to log in. You're going to need to log into Cobra, and I have made a few files for us to work with because I want to try to get to these things today so that you can see it on a basic level, because you're going to be working with your model, and your model is going to need to have textures added to it, and everyone's texture is going to be a little different. So when we start making textures, we have some choices to make. Can we get by with just a procedural method where we can just map something to it, a solid color, some noise, and some, we can adjust it like that to kind of make it look the way we want, or we can use some of the 3D textures in addition to that with some slight bumps to make it look like a certain type of material, or we have to map a file of some sort over it. So a picture of wood grain, or a picture of concrete, or a picture of bricks, or something like that, that we then start to slowly build up the way we want it to look through layering of the attributes of the material itself. So we have a map going to color, we have a map going to bump, we might have a map going to reflectivity, we might have a map going to eccentricity, whatever it is, to control the way that surface actually looks. It can become quite a network. And so far, all we've really done is added some color using a procedure and added a bump. And I was looking at your texture studies, and some of them look pretty good. And so we're going to build off of that. So before we, up till now, we haven't really modified the actual geometries, what's called UVs. And the UVs are a component of an object. So I'm going to create a simple sphere here. The UVs of this sphere are a component, just like edges are a component, just like vertices are a component, just like faces are a component. UVs are a component that look different than anything else. Well, they look different because they're a different color, but they basically look like vertices at this point. They are on the surface of an object, and they correspond to the color locations on a particular map. When we work with UVs, we are actually going to be working with another screen that is called the UV editor. And the UV editor lays out a grid of information within what's called the 0 to 1 space. So this is like a 2D grid. You can see this here. This is the center. This is more like a grid you would probably think be more commonly seen, where this is 0, 0, and it goes out to 1, and goes out to 1. And this here, these are the actual UV points on this surface. So what does that actually mean? That means that we can map an image And this is a default test image that we can actually use to see the checkerboard and the text as it's stretching over the object. These UVs in this location, I'm going to use the ones that you can actually see, are located right here. And if I move those in some way, it affects the actual way that texture is laying out over my object. If I scale these up, if I scale them down, or if I take an entire shell, this is an unadulterated shell. So here's an entire shell. It's the entire object, the entire object's UVs, and I'm literally shrinking them down as a whole and rolling the whole entire surface over a portion of this image. See that giant one right there, and how it's being shown in only the UVs within this location. Does that make sense? So I'm able to control this, and what I can actually do is I can actually select edges of my object, like this entire edge here, and I can actually cut it up using cut factor. I can say cut. Now I have two shells, and I can move this one over here. Over here, and I can put some sort of graphic here. I can rotate it however I like if I wanted to, and distort the whole thing. But the way whatever I do to it, it distorts the way that image is going to be expressed. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense, probably.
How did you open that panel?
So that's the UV texture editor panel. So under the modeling menu set,
Is the first one?
it's the UV editor.
Okay.
Yep. Let's try this for a second. Let's create a simple polygonal sphere. I'll delete mine. Create a simple polygonal sphere here. I'm setting it up in my scene. And let's do what we've been doing in the past, and let's create a panel, a split layout. So I'm going to go up to Panels, Layouts, Split, 3-pane split bottom. And we need a little bit of space for this, so I'm going to go up to my top panel here, and I'm going to make sure I don't already have a panel open, because I can't put anything in it if it's already out there. And in here I'm going to go to my Hypershade under my panel, and let's see, I just saw it. Where did it go? There it is. Hypershade. No, sorry, not Hypershade. UV texture editor. I'm sorry. UV editor. I'm thinking about more than one thing at once. And I'm going to roll this back here. And then down here I can bring up just a perspective for now. So there's several things to be thinking about when I look at this. There's one of the things to let me turn this checker off for a second. When we are working in the UV editor, we have this grid space, another type of grid space, and we're really working out of this one right here. There's going to be a single grid space, and if I move this shell into another space, if I have the image pulled up, I can pull up an image here, a little checkerboard, default checkerboard. It's going to move these around because it's kind of bleeding into these other spaces, but we want it to be in this space. So you'll look at this, the Y and the Z areas. So I'm just going to scale this down a little bit so it just fills that space. Imagine that this space is going to be an image, but this image could be something I paint in Photoshop based on the specific panels of the object that I want to paint into. So I think of textures and UVs like panels of clothing. If you look at your your clothes, you look at your shirt is made up of panels, and there are clear seams that go down the sides and around the shoulders. But if you were to cut all of those out, they're flat panels. A tube is a flat panel, right? It's not really a tube. I have to have a seam that is cut, and then the panel that makes up the sleeve can be laid out flat. That's what we do with UVs in 3D. We cut parts out. We want to make sure we can get it as flat as we can. It's like a pelt, like a skin rug. You've seen rugs of deer hide or bear skin or whatever it is. They've taken that animal, they've seamed it out, and they lay it out flat. That's exactly what we try to do. UV mapping, UV texturing, UV layout is an art form. It can be quite complex because you got to try different things to figure out the best way. And there's always going to be a seam. Notice this seam, this white line. That is the edge of one side where it meets on the other side. So this is a garment, right? And if I was to make this a tube or connect it, these edges would be shared. So I will have usually an ugly seam at some point somewhere, and our job is to try to make that as hidden as possible. There's a seam across the top, right here, across all of these points. They all converge, and they will cause distortion on our object. Notice how they start to converge and distort, and we will get problems like that, and we have to try to avoid them. But right now, that's a complex, that is an advanced thing. Right now we're just trying to get a basic layout where we cut things, move them to different locations. Does that kind of make sense? So all your objects, whatever it is basically made up of, in the beginning a cube, let's look at a cube. So we've seen kind of what a sphere that would be completely untouched looks like. So before we go, let's just look at this. If you have it selected, I am using this little icon up here that allow me to look at an image and what's called the checker map. So the checker map is a way to ensure that your proportions of your UV shells are equally at the same size. You don't have one that's great big and one that's little, because if one is great big, then the material or the information from that image will be distorted in some way. It'll look huge. If it's great big, the texture map will look really small. If it's really small, the texture map will look really big. So if you have something out of proportion, out of ratio to one another, then that could be an issue. But let's just look at these basic things. I'm going to bring up my UV editor here by tapping it in and just looking at some of the parts. If I right click, so if you hover over your object and I right click, you can see I can select edges, UVs, shells, the whole shell, and faces, just like we can select these things in as a component of of an actual piece of geometry. There you go. So if I said select shell, I'm going to be able to select the whole shell, and it selects the entire connected sheet of UVs. Since this entire model is just one big sheet of UVs, it hasn't been cut at all, I only have one shell in my scene. But let's cut this into a small portion. In order to do that, I need to select the edges. The edges of my model, I could select the edges of my model and go in and double click on an edge and cut that, or double click on an edge here. And I get this seam right down the middle. And if I was to cut that by just going into my cut and sew, I could say cut. And once I've done that, if I go into my UV shells, I should have one shell, two shells. I have two shells now because I cut it. There was already an edge back. There was already a seam here. So I have two shells. And if I move that, I can move that around and I can see how it's affecting the model on half of the model. Does that make sense? But what's cool is if I can cut this apart, I can also reconnect it. I can also sew it back together again. So that's why I think of this like a garment. I'm going to cut panels, I'm going to sew panels together. So if I wanted to, I could go in and say, since I know this is an edge here, it might be easier to just double click on this edge. Now I don't want that one, because if I sew this edge together, it's going to move this panel over there. And I could do that, but it would rearrange the way the model, the texture would lay out. If I double click on this one, I can sew these two together. So what I usually do when I sew these together is I go to the Cut Sew menu and I'll say Move and Sew. And what it'll do is it'll move that texture together. It'll move one to the other. Watch when I do this. It moved that one and snapped it. If I didn't say Move and Sew, if I just said Sew, it would stretch the UVs like it would when you weld something. And I weld something to the center, and you see how it, I don't know if you can see that too well. I'm gonna dim the background a little bit. Under Image, Dim, I can dim it so it's a little easier for you to see. When I sewed that, it moved that, and you can see, look at the difference in the UVs. These are squished now. See how these are squished together and made rectangles? Where this is a consistent square. And we want squares. We want it to be a square. Does that make sense? So let's try a concept. Let's break this into 4 squares. So I split it in half by cutting.
By picking the edge.
Oh, I just hit G. Sorry, I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to sew it together by saying Move and Sew. And then I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to cut it because I want to break it in half. I'm going to cut it in half. So I'm going to cut. That gives me 2 shells now. 2 shells that I can spread apart. And now I want to take another edge and just cut this in half. So basically I'm just making, and I can go over here and cut this one too just to save a step. And I can say cut like that. Now I should have 4. If there's nothing small connecting them, now I have 4 different sheets, right? Now if I were to grab all those together and move them, they would move somewhat unified, but there would be clear differences. Here we go. Is everybody able to do that? Let me see. So now I have a panel in this quadrant, I have a panel in this quadrant, in this one, and this one. Does that make sense so far? These UVs are controlling where the image is being displayed on my model. So I want you to see the difference when I scale down these shells in relation to the image itself. So here is this upper quadrant. I'm going to leave the same. So this is my target. Oh, were you able to do it?
I just did it weird. I didn't do it no, I didn't do it right, but I'll fix it.
Yeah, just so you can sew it back together or just undo. So if I'm not gonna mess with that one. I'm gonna take this one and I'm simply going to scale it down. So I want you to see what happens when you scale down the UV shell. And when I scale it down, I am revealing only a small portion of the model in the same amount of UV. So what happens to that? It appears that those checkers are now huge, right? So I'm showing the same color information only over a small amount of space. So there's the U right there, and it's giant. If I took another panel and I made it larger and I made it real big, notice that I am now expanding, and these things expand over, so think of this image duplicating over and over and over. So it's just like the same thing over and over and over, and your image would do that too. So if I did this, it would be the left side of the image and the right side of the image on the map. But as I scale that up, notice how it is making that image look super small, right? Does that make sense? And then same for this. If I distorted this, if I rotated it in some way, by just rotating it, then that is being reflected on my shell. And that's really important because sometimes you have to look at what the texture looks like on your surface to make sure the proportions are right. If you have skin pores, you don't want this cheek to have pores that are ginormous and these pores to have tiny pores, right? They all have to look the same. So before we even think about moving the picture in, we want to make it proportional if we have messed it up somehow. So what we would do is each panel, we would want to use our best estimates to look at the size of those and kind of get them back to the way they were so that they display as fairly consistently as possible, right? And there are tools that we can use to move and rotate things around, but we can also just kind of use our same tools that we've been using, right? So I tell you this because some of the features that we use to generate our UV maps can distort our UVs, make some small and make some big. And you want to be able to understand that you've got to kind of go back in and fix some of these things, and you want to be visually checking for it. So if I looked on my model and I saw a clear problem, or even if something like this, so for example, if I saw, and I'll just, I'm going to move this. If I saw this, right? If I'm looking at my map, if I'm moving this around and I look at that, I would say, what? What's wrong with that?
It's backwards.
It's backwards, right? So you can have UVs that are flipped on backwards, and you've got to be able to know, oh, that's not right. That has to be flipped. And I can use tools such as the modify flip attribute, and it has attributes to say, well, how are you going to flip it? Horizontally, vertically, from which position? So all I did was I just flipped that so you could see that sometimes these things are not always, it's not always easy to see how that they fit together. Does that make sense? Okay. So on a basic level, we have to create UVs from scratch essentially. When we have an object such as a sphere or a cube, let's get rid of the sphere now. Let's look at a cube. Let's just create a cube, and when we select it, we'll see the UVs pop up. And this is just like a cardboard box. If you were to take a cardboard box, break the seam on it, lay it out flat, it's going to look something like this on your floor, right? It isn't a box. It isn't a cube. It's a flat piece of cardboard that someone has bent in the right places to form a three-dimensional object, right? It's like origami kind of only. So here are the UVs of a cube, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to create a simple object, a cereal box, that is going to utilize moving the UVs as a very simple sheet of UVs into position over the appropriate image portion of a, did I say cereal? It's actually macaroni. Well, whatever.
Well, now the whole thing's right.
I know, forget it. So that's good. I know. Sorry about that. Got you all excited. So what we're going to do is, in Cobra, I have under UV mapping demo 3 files for you to download to your desktop. One is just called UV mapping student file. Download that. Macbox is just a macaroni and cheese box. and then Poly Spaceship. And I don't know if we'll get to all these, but we're going to begin with the Mac box, okay? The Mac box file looks like this. It's just an image, and I literally took my Aldi's macaroni and cheese, split the scene, put it on a photocopier, and made this. So this is not magic. This is really a box of macaroni, and I have it in my office if you want to see it for proof. This is 100% somebody else's work. But the idea is we can use this. We can use this. This is not, I didn't have to sit down and stew over this and in Illustrator or anything to make this happen. I literally just photocopied it. So in Cobra, when you are in Cobra, in the content, if you go to content, there is a section that says UV mapping demo. If you click on that, it'll pull up all these 3 files. And what I want you to do is have that image, and we can put it in a project folder. So some of you are still not creating project folders properly, so I'm going to demonstrate that again right now. And I'm going to call it texture or UV demo. So here I am in Maya. I'm going to go up to File, down to the project header, and say Project Window, because Project Window is where we create new projects. I have my project window up, and right now it's giving me the last project that I created. Now I'm going to say I'm making a new project. It's by clicking on the New button here. And that is going to automatically put it in a location somewhere, wherever it is that I have recently moved a file. If I want to change that, I'm going to just put that on my desktop by just clicking on that file here, the file location or the browse. And I'm going to redirect it to go to my desktop. But if you're at home, it's going to put it in a default project folder. If you're here, I don't know where it's going to put it on. It's someplace, probably a default project folder. But you got to know wherever that is, you got to know where it is, and you got to follow the path. So here's the path. This is on my C drive, under Users, under DDallas, and on my desktop. And I'm going to call this UV mapping. UV mapping, and we can say Mac if you want, or macaroni. I don't need to do anything else because all these scenes are going to be, all these files are going to be created. And I'm going to say accept. Now I'm going to make sure I know where that is because I don't want to lose it. So on my desktop somewhere there should be a folder. Here it is. So UV mapping right here. So I'm moving that. I know it's there. And inside of that there are all these folders, and I want to put in the source images folder this mac and cheese box. So I'm just simply going to copy it and put it in there. Paste. Okay? When you save your scene, you're going to want to save it in the scenes folder. So let's do that real quick. This should be set to that, but I want to make sure, I don't want to assume anything. I'm going to say File, Save Scene, and here it is. It's leading me to my C drive, under Users, DDallas, Desktop, UV Mapping Map, and it is in the proper scene. So this is correct. If yours isn't correct, then you're going to have to direct it to, you might have to go in and direct it to the file and search for it and find out where it is. But this is correct, so I'm just going to call this Mac box. Just macaroni and cheese box. And I'm going to put .mb on this just in case it doesn't append that on there. And sometimes it doesn't, but it has been this semester, but sometimes it won't. And then it won't show up and it'll look like an actual Maya file. We're going to get to that in a little bit, maybe.
We're just doing the Mac?
Yeah, we're just doing
okay.
the Mac, only macaroni and cheese, right? So we have our project folder in the source images file. There's my mac and cheese image, which is what I want to use, okay? I'm back in Maya now. Looks like I have a couple Mayas open, don't know why. Okay. Everybody with me? Does that make sense? We've been doing that since day 3, I think. All right. So let's make a box. We're going to make a very simple box. One that is actually slightly modified for the challenge factor. Here we go.
So you want us to start over? Get out of what we were.
No, you can use the,
Okay.
the generic box that you have. Let's shape this. And I'm assuming you don't have to watch me to shape it. Just get the general shape of a macaroni and cheese box, you know? Whatever you think it looks like. And I'm not talking family pack. I'm talking the single Kraft macaroni and cheese. So, okay? Let's pretend that pretend that that's perfect. So there it is. I'm going to name this my Mac box. Right there. Mac and cheese. Let's give it a material. What kind of material do you think it needs?
Probably maybe the blend.
Blend.
'Cause
All
there's
right.
a little bit of shine.
Sure.
to it.
Let's assign a new material. Maya surface. We're going to say blend just to give it a little bit of something. All right. Good. Everybody good with that? All right. Now, this is where we're going to start mapping things, and we'll start doing some this is very basic modifications. Like, we haven't even extruded this box. So typically, actually, this is the most perfect circumstance because the UVs haven't been altered at all. If we start extruding and modifying this, the UVs will get all changed, and then we really will have a little bit more work to deal with. But right now, we're going super preschool, right? Super preschool. We like preschool. Sometimes. Sometimes. All right, let's go into our color channel, and we're going to map something. I'm not going to open up my Hypershade or anything. I'm just simply going into, I'm selecting my object. I have a blend material, which I'm going to just say Mac box blend, so I know which one it is. And I'm going into the color channel, and I'm hitting the mapping button right here. And it brings me up my Create Render Node menu. And I'm in 2D textures, and I'm going to choose File. So something we haven't looked at yet, File. Notice that we get a 2D placement map node. So here's my 2D placement node, which has the same stuff that we've been doing. Repeat X and Y, rotate, noise. So all of this stuff is the same thing we've seen with procedurals, but we have a file now that is a little different. The file wants to know, what file are you going to be using? And in this case, we're going to be using an image. And I'm going to go over to the mapping button, or the browse button here, right here against image name, because it wants to know what image are we going to use. And I'm going to click on that, and it takes me to my source images folder, where I see what?
Mac and cheese box.
Mac box, docs, JPEG, right? So I'm going to choose that and say open. Oh, and it's sideways. That throws something into my plan. That's okay. If we hit 6 on our keyboard, notice that we get some of that image stretched out over our object, right? That's pretty cool, right? So let's open up, let's go ahead and do our UV. Let's go ahead and go to our UV. Since I started a new scene, I'm going to go 3 panes split bottom panel. What am I looking for?
The UV editor.
UV editor. And then I'll bring up my perspective view down here. So here's my UV editor. And notice that that image is right there. And so what I want to do is, I'm going to go to the image here, and I'm going to say dim. And I'm simply dimming that image so I can see my UVs, my edges a little bit easier.
Mine doesn't even look like mine doesn't even have that.
So
Create.
uncheck this checker box if you're using the same file you were on a minute ago,
Okay.
because this will allow us to see the image. So now that we have an image, we can turn it on and off,
Well,
Go back even one more.
or we can turn it on and see it turn off the checker. Go back to what?
I don't know where the UV image
The UV.
panel. I've got the
Oh.
3 split.
Okay. So go back to this panel and go up to panels. And under panel, it's at the very bottom, UV editor.
I have one more question.
Uh-huh.
You can scroll that far.
Up on your screen.
Yes.
I don't have all these that show up here. Neither does she.
You don't have your menus for your panels. It's
You
interesting.
don't have the edit, whatever. You don't have it either.
You might try restoring UV. I don't know if it will do anything for you. If you go up to Windows, and UI. Oh,
Sorry.
sorry, go to UI elements, and then say restore all UI elements. No, it did not. Well, that, yes.
Oh, I just had,
What's that?
I just had
need
trouble
that.
getting to the mac and cheese part.
Did you hit the 6 key on your model?
6.
If you hit 6, remember 6 will bring it up.
Oh, no, I mean the part where you got to the 2D.
Oh, select the map. Okay. So under your materials node, so I have my Mac blend, my blend. Under color, I'm going to go into my mapping button and I'm going to choose file, right? Do you see that? You have to map, that's the little checkerboard box. Now go to 2D file and then go to under Maya and then map the file to it. Did it? Let me see.
One more time.
So now that I have my textures, or my texture applied, I'm going to start moving my panels around by cutting apart. Oh, I'm going to find out which panel is what. So I'm looking at my model down here in my perspective. And I'm going to say this is my side panel, and this is the side panel that I want to put it on, that I want to be visible in that panel. So I'm going to start to cut this apart. So I'm going to choose an edge, and I'm going to use my cut and sew tool and just say cut, or I can use Shift X. And when I do that, I've cut this edge, so I'm going to say cut. Then I should have a separate shell. So this is now a separate shell. And I'm going to move this into position. But what I have to do is I still have to shape it to fit my this panel. So I'm going to go to my UVs just like if I were using components. And I can use them, and I'll get close here. We'll get very close with this because I just want enough to contain the information that I want. All right, so I'm going to get close here. I'm going to grab these top CVs and I'm going to drag them up to the top of this. And I might have to work with this a little bit to keep it within the white space. So I'm treating this like it is almost like we did with our components. I'm going to move these UVs around and try to get them to encompass as much as this as I can without cutting any of it off. So I might have to make some adjustments to it to make it a little bit wider. And look and see how it looks on my actual box. If I go into object mode, if I look at that, if I like that, if that looks okay, if it's not too bad. Now a lot of times we'll do this in a different way. We'll do a different process where we'll lay out our UVs and then we'll custom paint into the UVs so that we know exactly. But right now we're just basically putting the UVs around an image that we have to work with. So this might not be totally perfect, but it gets the basic idea of this concept.
And it shows you that you have to have it perfect.
Yeah, it'll show you. And boxes, even the cardboard boxes aren't perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and do this side panel here, and I may move this whole thing out of the way. At some point, I might just move it out of the way because I kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to do. So I'll just move that. And you can work with any part of it you want. So I'll do the same kind of thing. I'm going to select the edge I want. I'm going to cut that from that shell, select it. I'm going to move it into position. And then as I usually use my CVs, or sorry, not my CVs. I usually use my UVs to try to get things lined up where I want them. At one point, keeping things completely straight up and down. So I might get the boundaries like this, then I'll go back and then bring in the sides like this. And then I need to kind of see what it looks like on this edge. If I move it over, I get too much, so there's a crease right there, so I might just go right to that crease. And then I'm going to grab this. Oops, I'm going to grab these parts, and I'm going to get close to it because I'm really going to look at it over here. And if I don't like this, if I want to put it in a side-by-side panel, which makes it a little easier, I can put my perspective view over here. And I can put my UV editor over here. And then it gives me a little better space. So what I'm trying to do is move those UVs in. So I'm really looking at two screens at the same time. This one is kind of like my workspace, and this is the way it's going to look on the final model. So as I start to tweak that, I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to, these are small details that I want to get in place. There's a little bit of an edge. So I'm just going to start moving that around, which is kind of disorienting because as I move this down, that stretches up. If I move it up, it stretches down. So you kind of got to get used to all of that. So it's a completely different sensation when you're doing this.
And the edges have to be touching, right? Like when you...
You do not have to touch edges. I mean, you can sew them back together when we're done.
Okay.
So we'll sew it back together. We don't have to necessarily.
Okay.
And so this edge here, what was that?
I don't think it's going to work for me anyway.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it I'm not going to use this bottom tab, so it could work. You don't have to. So I'm going to do the front, and I don't actually have it. I'm going to go ahead and find my front panel. So here's my front panel. I'm going to cut that free. Go to the edge, I'm going to cut that. So it's a lot of you get into the flow of this. It's the workflow, it's a lot of repetition. If you like repetition, it's kind of like I'm going to find my middle. If I get quick at it, I can start using my scales, my scale tool, and start to stretch things out. Kind of get it closer this way. And work on one edge at a time. Grab those 2 points. Now, the thing is, once you get more and more geometry, so we're just working with 4 corners, right? Or 4 points, 4 UVs overall. When you have a model that has lots of mesh, you've got lots more dense UVs. You're going to have a lot more UVs to work with, which can be more complex. But the idea is, this is the same idea. We're trying to find, so I'm going to bring this edge, not so that the edge at the bottom of the box is right here. So I'm going to just bring it down at that point. And if I'm happy with it, I'm happy with it. I'm going to say, you know what, I can live with that. If I can live with it, I don't have any real issues. It starts to kind of flow. I don't like this, so this looks like something I want to fix. That looks like an error.
So when I'm doing
This is what I'm going to continue doing. I'm going to continue just kind of fitting my UVs around my image.
Well, that's because it's not super hard.
Yeah.
I mean, relatively speaking. When you have an object that has ins and outs, and lots of things like that, it's not going to be
I'm just going to kind of tweak this edge a little bit. I'm going to select this UV here, and I'm going to select this UV here, and I'm going to just give myself a little more room across there. And it feels a little bit better on the model. It doesn't feel so close. This feels a little too close for comfort. So I'm going to make those changes by looking at this. This is a little bit, this edge here and this edge here. I'm going to give myself a little more room to the side. And then once I'm happy with it, I'll move on to the next part. And this part is, so this part here is, I believe, the top. So I'll cut that, and I have a top tab right here. So I will move this up to that section. So I'll select the edge. I cut that. I have my face. I'm going to move it up here. I'm going to try to center it as much as I can. I'm eyeballing it. And then I'm going to scale it down, trying to read a little bit more. And then scale it out a little bit. And then go back and tweak that best I can. Now I could, what I will do is I will probably sew that edge to this edge so it flows. So I'll sew those edges back together. I get things the way that I like. I'm going to get that pretty square. Take these UVs and get that pretty square. Take these UVs and bring those down a little bit, just so I'm getting the color the way I want. Look at my box. Bring this over a little bit. Oops, I don't want that. So I want to be careful I'm not selecting too much. And then if I like that, I can take the edge, these edges here, and I'll sew them together. Once I have that, then I can modify, I can then go back and modify these edges a little bit if I want to move them around slightly, but then you can see the effect on my box. So I have to be careful, but I do have a little bit of margin here that I can work with if I want to give it a little bit. So I'm going to slowly kind of do that. Does that make sense? I got my top in place. I got my sides. Now I need to put something, I need the back. The back looks a lot like the front, so I could choose which one is the back. So here's my back. I'm going to go up and say edge, Shift X is my shortcut for cutting. Take my shell, going to move it down. A quick way to do this is I'm just going to say take these, move them over. Oops. I'm going to just take those, move them over, take these, move them over, grab these, move it up, grab these, move them down. There's not a lot of stuff in your way. Oops, but look at that, my panel's upside down. So, yeah, so I need to flip that. So my panel is upside down. So I need to take that shell, and I'm going to go up to modify, and I'm going to say flip. Now, am I going to flip vertical or horizontal?
It's like both.
So what did I just do? I flipped it vertical. So if I undo that, if I flip it horizontal, I can flip it that way, flip it again. There we go. So I'm going to have to flip it a couple times to get it flipped. One way and then back up.
But there's no place.
I could scale them and flip them backwards. So there's other things I could do, but I prefer to just flip if I need to. So that gives me my front, top, side, and now the bottom.
Where are we supposed to put the bottom? Because there is no actual.
I put the bottom as the same as the top.
Okay, all right.
And so you can just lay
I
your,
didn't know if that would mess it up.
yeah, you can just lay your bottom, no, you can overlap. So you can overlap UVs too. So as I overlap this corner, both, this can overlap on top of that one. So I'll just put that. I think they actually are the same, but it doesn't matter. I might have cut that off. So now you can make your own objects at home. Just take pictures of your objects, take it apart, make your own boxes, make your own textures. So now I've got this here. I've got stuff in the bottom. Make sure that looks okay. Looks like that needs to be flipped too. So I'll flip that. So I'll take that shell. I think I have it selected, so I should be okay. If I don't, I'll take that, go into modify. I'm going to flip, and I'll flip again. Flip in the horizontal. There we go. All right. So let's take a. So in Cobra in the Poly Spaceship file, download that to your desktop. And when you unzip it, it's going to say Project 3. It's going to say Project 3 because this is from a book from many years ago that I think is a nice example of kind of using image maps and values for black and white to control things like color, or to control things like specularity and dirt and that sort of thing. So I want you to bring that, put that on your desktop and unzip it. And then again, it's in the model, or the file will say Project 3, and right here. And in that this is a project folder, so you can set to project. So let's go ahead. Oh, I'll wait till you have it. So we're gonna. Let me know when you have it on your desktop and it's unzipped. To unzip, you right-click on the file. I use 7-zip, or there might be extract all is another way. 7-zip and extract here.
Okay.
And when it extracts, it'll bring up a project. It should say Project 3.
Oh, yep.
And inside, and so that is actually a Maya project folder. So if you double-click on that, you have the same thing that we've been talking about. There's a scenes folder, and we're going to use this file, PolyShip, and we're going to be looking at the source images, which is a bunch of files for color, bump, reflectivity, specularity, and that sort of thing. And this is the kind of thinking that many of you, this is what we would be using a lot of times, a bunch of files that have been painted specifically for this spaceship, or whatever it is that you're doing. So we use Photoshop right now. We can use Photoshop to take UVs that we organize in a specific way, like we did for this box of macaroni. And we can, so what we have now is we're going to import this little spaceship. But right now, if we wanted to, we could take these UVs laid out in this manner, and we could take that image file and we could change it to be whatever we wanted, right? It doesn't have to be macaroni and cheese. It could be any kind of box, because all we're doing is changing the image. So if I know by using basically the grid, so if all I ever saw was this, right? If I was using this as my dot to dot or color in the lines, then I would know that this is my side panels, my top, bottom panel, my front and back. Then I could paint and design my own picture, right? And then that would be my own custom picture. I could take this picture and I could change the name of this. So I can alter it because it's only an image, right? I'm in charge. I can take this picture and I can modify it any way that I want. What we're going to do right now is we're going to import, or we're going to set project. So I'm going to create a new project. You've got your own project saved. We called it your macaroni and Mac box. So go ahead and save that as Mac box and then make a new scene. And then what we're going to do is I am going to set my project to this project 3 file. So I'm doing that by going into File. Instead of making a project, I'm not going to say project window, I'm going to say set project. So under File, under the project header, I'm going to say set project, and I'm going to find that project that's on my desktop. It's called project 3 at the moment. I got to find it right here. And I'm simply going to click that. I'm not going to go into it necessarily. I'm just going to say set. And now it's going to choose to go into that file. So now it's going to go into the scenes folder directly. And I'm going to bring up poly ship. And now this is a ship that's already been modeled. And it should pop up. It should pop up for anybody.
Didn't pop up. I can import it,
It's in him,
but I
eh?
couldn't open it.
Yeah, let's go ahead and import it then. I'm going to go up to File, Import, and I'm going to say PolyShip MA, Import. I just did it. Okay.
I've seen this, I think, before on YouTube.
Yes, this was a classic. This is a classic. I'm going to see if it's actually in here. So here's the geometry for it. But for some reason,
You got that the other day, it was like it was
is it working for anybody? I literally just had it in there.
That's the only way I got it over
I
here.
had the
Poly
color
ship.
version.
Yeah.
What's that?
I had the color version.
Yes,
I don't have the
it's
version
okay.
they have.
I'm going to
They have
close
the-
that.
the
So some of you got it
Did
in.
you go into
I had
the
to
source
create a
code?
new scene and import it that way.
We're not getting the NURBS ship, Bailey. We're not using that
Did you
one.
go- Oh,
Yeah, we're going to undo
Was
that.
that-
Yeah,
was that what
that's the
you
final
did
project.
image.
So I had to shut down Maya and reopen it in order to import this. So again, I went to File, Import, and then I'm choosing Poly Ship.
I still don't have this.
And this is a very, very, very simple poly ship. It's actually based off a cube, and it's a very simple polygonal model. That this is a classic tutorial from 2003, way back, and it's actually quite good. It isn't. It is actually quite applicable to many things. In this scene, I want to clean up this scene a little bit, so I'm going into my outliner. And I'm actually going to expand some of these things, and I'm going to get rid of some of the textures that exist, because this has actually been textured already, but I want to go back. This is our goal. So as you can see, this little spaceship has a painted image on it. It's got a bump map on it. It's got specularity on the windshield. So as you move it around, you can see that some of it is semi-shiny and some of it is shinier than others. So the goal of this is to take an organic object and lay that, and we can look at the UV editor and see the UVs here and kind of see the image. Now it's gonna be a fun day today. I can see that. It's going to be good. So when we look at this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open it up in using FCheck. So these are IFF files. So I'm going to say open image, and IFF files are files by the Autodesk company. And I'm going to go into Project 3, go into Source Images, go into Polycolor, and open it up. And you can see the color map. So this is the color map. These are the wings. So let's kind of look at this, since I can't show it to you at this very second the way I want to. You can kind of envision the UVs here and the actual shape of the model and the actual color here. This goes over the wings, so you can see that. So the wings here, and these little edges flow over. These are the little lines that go across the back end of this object. This is specifically cut to fit across just this sheet of faces right here. So this has actually been, if you look at the shell, here's the shell, and it's going to be laid across that section of the model. Let me close out some of these, and you can see that as it illuminates. So there's the shell here. So it's actually disproportionate, but it's covering up that portion. The tail fin is here, and it's actually laying across this portion of this model. So even though this object is, it's not flowing. Like I said, it's made up of different parts, and they're using different parts of this single image to be masking basically over that. So they basically have a side projection. So this is actually a UV shell that is it's overlapping, right? So the seam for that is actually right here, and that's right there. So it's an overlapping shell. So if I took this up through here and I were to cut it, I would have two shells overlapping. So that's why we see it on both sides. See the star emblem? And I've just selected these shells of my cockpit here, and I am moving that panel of shells over there. So this is sitting right underneath it. Does that make sense? Even though I can't show it to you, it might show up on yours. Select your object, pull up your UVs, and see if it pulls it up. Select your actual object. So open up your UV editor by going up to the UV and editor and see if it will pull up your UVs. Select your object.
You made it 3 different pieces?
Yeah. That's the cockpit, that's the tail, and then the object itself. So select
now
6.
I have a 5-way window.
Okay.
So you can see it.
That hurts my eyeballs.
What are you looking at? Here, let me see. Select your object.
Okay.
If the UV map is not coming up,
Yeah.
we're going to select the object. We're going to go to the poly blend node that has our blend material. So this is just our blend material. I'm going to break the connection to the old file map, like that. And I'm going to go to the mapping button, and I'm going to say File. So I'm creating a new mapping, and I'm going to go to the folder, and I'm going to choose Poly Color, IFF, and I'm going to say Open. And when I select my object, then it's going to bring up and make a new connection to that. And what we can do is see what this looks like. So I can right-click on the shell and say, there's that shell. This is my windshield. This is basically, then the rest of the model was actually made by doing what's called a planar mapping, and we're gonna go through that now. Everybody able to see that? Did it work? And just like before, if we change any of these UVs, so if I grab a bunch of UVs like I did here on the wing and I move that, you can see that it's distorting the material placement or the image, the texture placement of my object. Okay? So all of you could take this UV map, we could make a little blueprint of this basically that has nothing but the UVs on it, and you could actually take this and paint your own textures for this model, which would be similar to this or whatever you wanted to do. Does that make sense? It's like painting numbers, painting in between the lines. And that's what this person, whoever designed this, that's what they have done. They've painted over this surface.
Pick the right one. Go back.
The reason why the project folders are so important is because if you're not pointing into the project folder, it's looking for certain materials in certain places that don't exist. And so some of you have it connected and some of you don't have it connected and stuff like that. So, all right, let's stay on this particular task, because what I want you to see is the basic idea of starting with an object that doesn't have the UVs already laid out for you. So now you can see the UVs and how they're laid out and what the goal is. But what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and save a scene. So we'll go ahead and just save this scene as a safety. So I'll call it save as PolyShip safe. And that's just something we can go back to as a reference.
Safe.
Yeah, you can just call it safe. So I'm just going to call it safety. Oh, PolyShip, not employee. This is just to say, you know what, I'm going to make some changes to this model. If it doesn't work, I can go back to where I was. This is just a safe. I'm not going to mess with that. Actually, that's just there to be saved. And now I'm going to save this as save scene as PolyShip no UVs. So this is what I'm going to no UV.
So save another one?
Yes, so we'll save another one. So we just saved one that we can go back to as a safety, and then this is the one we'll work on, and if we don't like what we've done or something goes wrong, we have that safe file.
No UV.
Yeah, no UV. We're going to delete the UVs of this model and create our own.
Sure we are.
Ye of little faith. Come on.
Oh, we're gonna delete them. We're just not gonna get them back.
I'm going to say I'm going to just break the connections to all these things here, just by going through and saying break connections. We're basically starting with a fresh model, and remember we have a safety. So this is kind of like starting from scratch. I didn't want us to have to model the whole thing and then do all this, so this is kind of a shortcut. And so now what I'm going to do is, normally when we have a model like this and we've been modeling it, it is going to be all messed up. It's going to have UVs in all kinds of crazy places, and it's going to look really, really weird and be impossible to texture. So we want to organize those in the best way that we can. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go up to select our object like I have it selected, and I'm going to go up to UV editor, and I'm going to say I'm going to go up to UV, and I'm going to say delete UVs. And when I do that, I have deleted the UVs. Notice that I don't have anything defined here at all.
And where did we get it?
So under UV, delete UVs. Let's see where it's right in front of my face. Delete UVs right here. So
Okay.
we're basically starting from scratch. There's no UVs on this at all. And so I'm going to close that. All right. So what we want to do is we want to create some of our own. Now sometimes when we create UVs, we have to create them in different ways. When we were working with that box, it was already flat. It was already flat, and we didn't have to really create them. They were already laying properly, and so it was fairly easy to modify. When we begin to make our own, UVs, we have to do some additional work for that. So let me go ahead and I'm going to go into my different panels here. I'm going to drag this down a little bit. And I'm going to pull this out and close it. For you guys, I'm going to go into layouts, just like what we've been doing. Layout, 3-pane split bottom. And up here, I want to put in my UV editor. And so I want to just put in my UV editor up here up at the top. So I don't have any UVs really to show right now. So what I have to do is I have to assign them or try to capture them in a manner that works best. And when we look at the UV node or the UV tool up here, or if I was to go down here under create, I can see there's a variety of ways to do it. One's called automatic, one's called cylindrical, one's called planar, one's called spherical. And what these try to do is they're starting points of the core shape of your object. So if you were doing a coffee cup or a mug, this is a cylinder, right? This is the cylinder part. The base shape of it is a cylinder. If I was doing a bowling ball or a golf ball or a head, I might start with a sphere. And what it tries to do is take a picture of all those UVs using a spherical model or a cylindrical model. And automatic takes a picture of it from 6 different views. Some of them from the bottom, some of them from the sides, some of them from the front and back. And it just pukes them all over the UV space. So watch what I'm going to do. You don't have to do this because you'll probably melt and your brains will explode. So just watch what I'm going to do. All right. If I were to do a cylindrical map, it gives me a tool that is wrapping around my object, and it's throwing out a shape of UVs. These are all UVs, and I have some tools here to modify and work with. But in the end, I get this UV shell that looks like crap. Like it doesn't make any sense. I can't paint this, right? All right, so that didn't work. If I go up to UV and I say create a spherical map, it's going to try to capture it from a spherical. Now, some of this might work. There might be some areas of this model that might work well. If we turn on our checkerboard, and I can see that this part looks pretty good, right? That's readable, and that makes sense. But this is all stretched, and this is kind of wacky, and so that didn't always work. So what I could do is I could map certain parts of it. Maybe I do the nose in a spherical, and I do planar over the wings, and I'm separating out these groups of faces, and I'm mapping it like that. That might be what you have to do, but let's see if there is something. How much can we get for free with this kind of computation? Then take apart what we need. So spherical, that ain't gonna work. That sucks too. Then there is create automatic, and watch what that does. Actually, this is pretty cool because what it does is it takes all of these different pieces and it breaks it into lots of parts. And this might work because I have some beautiful wings here, and I can see the jet engine tail pieces, and there might be the top fin. Well, you can see where it is down here as I hover over it. And so some of these parts might work, and that might be something we put back together. I might be able to sew some of these together. But there's just a lot of pieces that you can see, all the different seams, right? So that might work. And a lot of people do that just for quick and easy method.
So where the white is in your
Yes.
perspective mode or wherever, that would be a seam when you put
All
it
of
together.
these white edges are seams.
Okay.
That's where the edge of the texture
So you would see those.
ends, right here. So this seam on this object is going to make up that little puzzle piece right there. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's just automatically creating these for me. What they did in this model is they actually take a planar shot from the Y. We can take a planar shot from the front. If I were to do that, that will give me a nice overlapping view. So this is pointing in the Z. So if I said planar, and if I use the options box and I say in the Z axis, I will get a, oh, sorry, you don't want to separate. Sorry, I had faces. So when I do it in the planar, it's taking a planar image of the front of the plane. You can see here's the fins. Then somewhere around here is the nose, right? If I were to look at the edges and I were to grab the nose is here. All right? That's okay, but it doesn't work. So if I did it in the X, it's going to look like a side view of it. And so if I said planar from the X, it's going to look like the side. And then what they did is they actually took a shot from the top. And so they said UV create planar from the Y project. And this is the shape of the image, right? This is the shape of what they have painted over. And so they actually have the top and the bottom faces, so the faces are overlapping. So these faces up here are also overlapping these faces down here. All right, and for this, it actually works, and they can get away with it. So if I was to go into object mode here and assign a color map to this, like we've done, polycolor, just like we've done already. Oh, this will be fun. Turn that off. I can see here is my image, and if I take my shell and I rotate it around and orient it like they've done in some cases, where, let me dim it a little bit, I may have already. You can kind of see, let me bring this up, see how these parts of the object are starting to fit over parts of this. Does that make sense? So I might need to scale this down a little bit so that the parts of this model, and I'm going to have to just, again, I'm going to have to move things around a little bit so I get this paint. And since I didn't paint it, I don't know the intention of all of those edges, but if I did, I could do this. And then I can quickly see the paint job on my ship. And it's stretching basically over, so the same image is on the top and on the bottom. Now what they did is they said, you know what, I want that decal to go right here. So I'm going to take these faces, and I'm going to do it really quick. And I'm going to take these faces right here, and on the other side, and forgive me if it's not perfect, but, and I'm going to do a planar mapping of that. And I'm going to say I'm going to make these a planar mapping in what direction? What direction?
Side.
No, side is not a direction.
Oh.
Side is
Sorry.
not a direction. What's the letter of the direction?
Oh. It X.
No.
That'd be Z.
X, the side. Z is the front.
Use front.
X is the side. So I'm going to do that, and you got to know that so that you can choose the right planar. And I'm going to say apply. And now I have these UVs. This is where having 15 monitors at home come in handy. Not that I do, but it would come in handy. So I have these what I want to be able to do is take this and scale it down and put it over my object, which has not appeared to show up, so I'm going to guess where that is. Where's the little star? So right there. See the little star I'm going for? This is how you do things blind. Okay, so there's my star, and I used it because it's a nice solid color, right? It's a nice solid color and it blends in. So if I wanted to do something like that across my cockpit here, I might take these 4 faces, or sorry, not 4, these 6 faces here, and I'm going to do a planar mapping from which direction? Don't fail me.
That would be Y, wouldn't it? 'Cause you
Yes,
want it to be-
correct, Y. So Y, project. Now I have a planar map of these faces in this region, and I know that it's over there somewhere, and even though it's not wanting to show me. And I can move that into this area, and there's the cockpit, and as I move this around and shape it, I'm just working with technical problems at the moment. If I scale this down, right, as I make it bigger, it gets smaller. As I make it smaller, it gets bigger. Okay? All right. Now, if I wanted to customize all of that, so now I've got my ship. It's skewed a little bit, I get that. But you kind of see how I did that? So I'm breaking things apart, specific faces, which can become shells, which can then be moved over an image that I either create myself or already exists, which helps. And then what we do, because once these UVs are created, and I'm using the same type of map So for instance, I'm using similar maps for bumps. So let me show you that. So for a bump, I'm using a black and white map. White is elevated, gray is not elevated, black is indented. Because I've moved my UV shells all around, this is going to be the wings, this is going to be the cockpit, this is wherever. There isn't going to be one for the star, but the star is over here. But it's going to define the bump. So I don't have to worry about doing anything else other than just saying, look, in my bump map, I'm going to use my bump map, I'm going to create a file, I'm going to choose that file, and it's already labeled for me. And once I do, look how it lines everything up. All those creases are now indented. That bump map has a value of a depth value that I can control and make negative or positive, right? So I can work with that. Same thing for specularity. As I go into my object, if I want to say, well, what's going to define the specularity of this object or the reflectivity of it or the reflected color, I can do that. What they did was in the color channel, as I go into this node, I have some color gain values, and that can control the amount of color. It's basically like a multiplier. It multiplies the color values with the black and white value, and this is where they connected a 3D texture fractal, and you could use Brownie or something like that. Where is the fractal fluid? So well, if I put something on there, there it is. So as I have that 3D mode, 3D node, that if I move around or if I control that, it's multiplying or going into the texture channel or the texture channel for color, and it's creating a sense of dirtiness to that model. So that's the idea of taking an object like this, organizing the UVs, arranging that so that we can utilize a color map of some sort, some type of texture that is a painting, a digital painting, a photograph of something, and then just building up layer by layer by layer these kinds of
So
details.
You would originally in Maya make your UV map, and you would bring that into Photoshop or whatever, and that's where you could create it, and then you would bring them both back in here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so once we have kind of the UVs laid out, we can actually take a snapshot of the UVs, of the UVs that we want. Sorry. Nope. And once we have it, let me get the right window up here. I can take a UV snapshot of this. And I'm going to make these edges a middle color, like so. Choose the type of file that I want, the size that I want, how big a file that I need to, the file size that I want to paint, which would be nice and large if I needed details, and say apply. It's on my desktop, project 3 images. So if it did, here's my UV map. Well, that one you can't see it very well, but it's got the details of the images. Can you see that? That's my dot to dot. That's what I paint to. So I'll put this on a top layer or a bottom layer, and then I paint into that. Then I have an image, but I don't want to show my dot to dot. I'll hide that layer when I render it out, when I render out the actual image. And that's how we make a custom map for something. That makes sense? It's a lot. There's a lot of processes that go into this, but it does end up creating the final project. And then there's lots of versions. You know, there's the specular layer, there's the bump layer, there's the diffuse layer, and all that. So you take this information and then paint the details. So when you start painting that sort of stuff, you can come up with some pretty nice looking, files. Let's see if I'll real quick, and then I know we guys got to go. So for instance, let me see if I can show you something. When you get into it, you can paint some pretty interesting details. So this is the painted mesh, or the painted image for a painted, let me show you the actual helmet. This helmet here. So this is using, this is basically a fairly simple model, but then I'm painting these details. This isn't the exact file that this has, but you can see the details of it as it's rendered, and I painted that. Let me see if I have my. So in the Photoshop, I've had to paint the details of it. Let's see if you can see it before you go. I think what I did is I took in. So this is like layers for the bump. This is what I used to just create the bump map. So this has some color on it. So that's just the bump file. And see if I have my color file in there. You can kind of see the these different elements too. So here is probably the one that you're seeing rendered on that model, where I have the rust and everything on the edges. So really, I'm just painting out. I'm blocking out paint, and I'm removing the edges. So the corner of the corner of the helmet here, I painted in a stripe of red, and then I went back and I erased that. I have a sheet metal underneath, so I have a sheet metal base on top. So I'm working in layers. You know, I have Photoshop, you have all these different layers. So I have like, what's the bottommost layer? It's metal. So I have an image of metal. And then on top of that, I have color, and I paint the hue of it. So here's my color samples right here. This is the Boba Fett color palette offline. You know, just go find it. And so I paint this color in the section that I want. So my UV map is laying out this part. Then I take that color and I paint the visor. This is the top and the side, and this is the orange earpiece, and this is actually the visor over here. And then I remove some of that paint, and then on top of that I put rust and different bumps and different things that slowly build it up to make it the final version. That's actually a reference. So these are my references. That's my sheet metal that I used for a base image. There's specular and stuff like that I painted. There's the rust that I used. Those are the rust speckles that I used. That's the reflection map that I used to reflect an environment. And so those are all of the little pieces that I've used as what I've used to try to plan. There's a really good model of it. There's my palette. So that's what kind of goes into it to then make the final, the final version that you guys are seeing. The final render is that. So all of those things go into creating that. And you can see when you have the bump, and you add the bump, and you have all those different layers, it gets pretty cool. I mean, it creates a pretty cool effect. So the bump defines the in and the out of this paint. The sheet metal is underneath the painted metal. The rust is on top of that. And I just it's fun to go in and just create this environment, create this world that you can kind of make it as much as you want. This is what it would look like if I didn't do anything, just pure and shiny. And I didn't put anything really in the specular, and I didn't even paint that. That looks flat, right? Because I didn't even touch it. This is where all the details and work went. This is just generic nothing. I haven't even touched it yet. I don't have anything done to it. And you can see it sucks. But that's what goes into kind of all the different layers of creating this sort of thing. And it's a lot of fun, but it obviously doesn't happen overnight. Well, sometimes it does. I think that might have happened overnight, but anyway, that's a bad joke. See you later. Have a good day.